Yes.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to this lecture this evening. This is our keynote speaker for our module on our programme Sustainable Food and Natural Resources. This is Tim Lamb. I'm very pleased to welcome him this evening. And I believe Tim to introduce himself more fully. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. And thank you, everyone, for coming on a late evening in the middle of winter to talk about this lot. Are you checking?
Checking mics on. Is it on?
We're being recorded, by the way, in case you worry what...
sounds like it's on. Sorry to interrupt.
It's recording, yeah, it is. So this is part... I'm here doing this as a public lecture, but actually for the course, the MSc on Sustainable Food and Natural Resources here at CAT, this is lecture 4. So you've got a hidden audience which is being recorded, hence the worrying about the taping. When sort of thinking about this, I didn't just want to do what I did last year in the same format, and the same, there's partly a public lecture and partly on the CAT Masters. There's one very big elephant in the room, Brexit. And here we are in Britain, in Wales, at CAT, which has been such a powerhouse of thinking about sustainability, and one that I've admired from far for decades, and I knew people right at the beginning. Everything is now being changed by Brexit, and it's being changed whatever happens next week in the vote. Whatever happens on March the 30th, it's all different, because the divisions in Britain are now out. They're in the middle of the room, and it is unavoidable. And I sat in my room in London, where I work and live, and thought, actually, even though we're in Wales, and there's a virtual listening going on or watching, let's discuss it. So, and I happen to also be writing a book about what we should be doing, Brexit or no Brexit, on food. So I'm partly thinking about that, which was some themes I raised in my lecture last year at CAT. And for various reasons, in the last year, I've spent a lot of time thinking about biodiversity because I've been the chair of a very big international commission put together by the Lancet, the medical journal The Lancet, together with a Norwegian foundation, the Eat Foundation. And for the last 3 years, I've been one of 18 people thrown into a room, meeting around the world, just trying to think, what's a good diet? What's a good diet, and how are we going to do it? And can the world do it? And that report is coming out actually next week, which I can't talk about because it's all under wraps. But there are no secrets about the broad thinking that report is giving, which is basically we're in serious trouble unless the world eats differently. And nowhere is that more important than in the rich world. It's the rich world which has to change in a dramatic way. And the Zero Carbon Britain work was just a really useful thinking about that, and a modelling done here at CAT, if you don't know it, and the students here, you really need to go and look at that. But I'm a policy man, and I'm going to look much more about the politics of it and the policy frameworks. It's not a matter of individual choice. If I drop dead in 10 seconds' time, let that be my last words. It's not up to you as an individual. Unless the population changes, forget it. If Britain changes dramatically in its diet and goes vegan overnight, which is highly unlikely, if the rest of the world carries on developing the dietary transition as it is, the world cannot survive under 3 degrees climate change growth. So it's a very, very, very sober situation we're in. I'm someone who was ex-Polytechnic trained. In other words, I lectured at them, and I learnt very early on, put in the first slide what your lecture is, and then you can all go to sleep. So this is it. Basically, I'm going to be running through. I can't remember how many slides it is. I've got a lot. I always do too many slides, and that's partly for the students so you can look at them later. And I do quite dense slides, so forgive me. I break Bill Gates's rule, which is that you should only use one slide for every 2 minutes. I probably do 3 a minute or something at times. So this is the one I'll spend time on. Basically, probably this audience doesn't need to have it explained, but the rest of the world does need to have it explained. The global food system is creaking. I put that word. I don't want to underestimate how successful it's been. It is quite staggering that 5.5 billion people are being reasonably well fed or very well fed. If you'd said that 60 years ago at Aberystwyth, the end of the Sir George Stapleton era, he'd have laughed and they'd have laughed. Impossible. You couldn't feed that amount of people in any way. There has been a staggering growth of output of food, more people being fed, people living longer. There's a huge success story in food, and I don't want to underestimate that, even though we're now faced by major, major crises. So I put it politely here, we're torn between success and failure. And it's the failures which are now catching up, the challenges. And if anywhere in the world exemplifies it, it is Britain. And if there's anywhere in the world where that politics is not being rooted in, it is Britain, because frankly, no one should have voted anywhere on Brexit, whichever way you or they voted, without thinking about the food system, and it did not feature at all. It was staggering. Absolutely staggering. Here is a country that only produces less than 60% of its food, said it's going to leave where it gets 40% of it from. You couldn't invent it. Well, you could actually. This is an imperialist legacy society. This is a country which has been used to being a parasite. It's used other people's land. It's used other people's resources, and it's usually chopped off hands in order to maintain control over it. And it did it when it had a vast navy, could protect the supply lines. And even then, in 1939 to 1945, it came very close to crumbling. Okay? And my lecture last year, I talked about the navy. People came expecting me to talk about food, but I talked about the navy. My book will talk about that at great length. Anyone here guess how many ships Britain has today? Paul, you know everything.
Military ships or?
Yeah, Royal Navy ships. Royal Navy ships. 10? A bit more? Yeah, good. 77. Anyone tell me how many ships we had in 1939? 1,400. Okay? I'm not going to talk about that, though. But you know, for people who think that Britain leaving the European Union is a matter of reclaiming Churchillian empire type sort of grandeur and will be free trading, free floating, self-regulating, controlled society, have we got the infrastructure? Is the question. I'm going to talk about Brexit. I'm going to give very quickly, I've worked our centre, I should have said, I'm Professor of Food Policy at City University in London, and we set up the first and still the only centre on food policy worldwide, but there's now a network of centres working on food policy, which is great. We saw Brexit coming, and we started working on Brexit 4 years ago. We said, look, if this is going to happen, food's got to be a key part of this discussion, and we failed completely. We did reports, we did the first big and only conference on Brexit and food before the referendum, and it just sank without trace. We couldn't get people from the food industry to come, couldn't get them until at the last minute, suddenly 2 people came, actually, which was really good. It's because everyone didn't want to think about it. Well, now we're going to have to think about it very carefully indeed. So I'll talk about that. And then this acronym I've got, what we ought to be talking about, what we ought to be doing, WWOTB. And this is no secret, it's a phrase I coined for the Lancet Commission next week. We're calling in the Lancet Commission for the Great Food Transformation. There has to be a fundamental shift of the food system in different countries in different ways. I'm not giving away a secret by saying that. And so I'm going to flag, and actually I want you, while I'm talking, to be thinking. I'm going to give you the exercise I give my students on our masters and my PhD students. You've got 3 minutes with the President exercise, if you know it, or 3 minutes with Mrs. May. God spare you. Because I can tell you the head of Tesco has met Mrs. May and said 2 years ago, you're taking us into a food policy crisis, food security crisis, Prime Minister. Anyone guess what her reaction was? She's the head of Tesco. Okay? What do you think she said? The market will solve. Good. She said nothing. So we went back a month later and said it again. She still said nothing. So we're in actually quite and I will talk a little bit about what my discussions with Michael Gove have been. Although we're in Wales, this is a problem. Brexit is a problem of England. Okay. So you can go to sleep now. What's the problem in the food system? It's basically the first line. There's a mismatch of our bodies and the production system. Where now there are 2 billion people overweight, only 0.8 billion hungry. That's happened in 30 years. It's a complete reversal of the model that Stapleton down at Aberystwyth, John Boyd Orr up at Aberdeen, and that whole brilliant wave of 1930s British food, agriculture and soil scientists did, which Saskia's talked about in her first lecture. I know they basically applied science to food, mostly on agriculture, but not entirely, and unleashed the potential to grow more, produce more, intensify production in a way that we now are worried about, but then it seemed like the sensible thing. Now we know that it's driving climate change, CO2 equivalents, water, food waste. In the 1930s, 30% of all food was wasted. Today, 30% of all food is wasted. In rich societies, it's consumers who waste it. In poor societies, it's wasted at the point of production. They never dreamt of that. We've actually added to the complexities of the problems from a policy which was brilliantly simple, which said, let's just produce more food and the world's problems to food will go away. So it's what we call at our centre productionism. The production will resolve the problems of food. Production will not resolve the problems of food. It depends how we produce. It's a shift from quantity to quality, modes of production. Policy making is always slow. In my lecture tomorrow with the students, I'll be talking about the relationship between evidence, policy, and realities. So I won't go into that too much. But for now, let me just say, policy makers don't lead, they follow. And we're in a problem where the evidence is piling up so fast over the last 30 years, and the policy is only just beginning to address some of it. And one of the big problems we've got is that all policymakers are frightened of consumers. No one wants to tell consumers what to do. And that's tiptoeing us into crisis. We've got to change consumption. In very pompous academic terms, the fourth bullet point, what we've gone is from a simple criteria approach to food policy to where we now need a multi-criteria approach. We've got to have biodiversity alongside climate change, water alongside nutrients, social inequalities alongside health, and so on. How to juggle all of those criteria together at the present is beyond the policymakers' capacities. But I'm going to give a very positive account of saying some bits of this policy framework are beginning to emerge. And what we need is this bottom one: we need a new integrated food policy. If you listen to Mr. Gove in London, or indeed the Welsh government or the Scottish government, they're still talking about agriculture. Forget agriculture. Agriculture is tiny in the food economy, absolutely tiny. Agriculture employs 450,000 people. That's a lot. The food system employs 3.9 million. Catering employs 1.7. Catering is much more important for shaping people's tastes and what they eat than agriculture. We've got to shift, and I speak, by the way, as an ex-farmer, so don't think I'm one of these Londoners who thinks food comes from the sky. It's grown, it's fished, it's nurtured, and it's complicated. But we've got to de-emphasize agriculture and put agriculture back into its proper place, being about feeding people. In fact, my accusation with Michael Gove has been that he is technically Secretary of State for DEFRA, and he's not, he's DERA, he's forgotten food. If you follow his thinking in his agriculture bill, food doesn't feature at all. The future of agriculture is to be environmental land management. Food? Well, the tacit assumption, this is a man who was a leader of the Brexit campaign, is basically we import it. You have a pretty British countryside and you import it from other people. This is, as I say, forward to 1846. So this is a very, very, very amazing thing. Well, and now turn to what do we think we should be about? It's this. We've got to dramatically change, let me think Britain, what people eat. Britain eats about 2 portions of fruit and vegetables on average, 3 a day. It should be 9. And at the moment, we import almost all of it. No, it's not strictly true. We import 45% of the vegetables and 90% of the fruit. You can't grow mangoes. I was brought up in India. I love mangoes. You can't grow mangoes in Britain. But we're importing 80% of our apples. Why? When Brogdale has 2,300 varieties in the national collection. I mean, it's not British apples. We think of apples as British. They're Persian. You know, when you eat food, you eat the world. But the point is, how's it being grown? Who's growing it? Whose labor? Grown in what way? We've got to change the meat consumption. I won't prefigure the Lancet report, but wow, is it awesome. We've got to reduce meat. Now, I'm an ex-Welsh black pedigree cattle breeder, believe it or not. I don't look like I am. Bought our herd from Dolgelly, the Pedigree Welsh Black Society. But I like Welsh Blacks because they're thrifty. You can throw them on a hill and they'll eat. We are now 40% of all grain on the planet is being fed to animals. 30% minimally in some countries. This has to change. Not just for ecological reasons, but also efficiency reasons, but also public health reasons. The evidence on red meat consumption is now just so strong. We cannot. Caroline Lucas, the Britain's one and only MP, gave a brilliant speech at the Oxford Farming Conference last week. If you want to look at something there, have a look. We've got to tackle this notion that having meat all the time is aspirational. That applies less to Britain, because in Britain we've got that. We've got to make, actually, something very interesting is going on in Britain of making it's aspirational to be vegetarian or flexitarian or vegan even. It's trendy. Okay? That's not what I want. I don't want trendiness in Shoreditch in London if it's not affecting people on low incomes in Cardiff. We've got to be very, very, very socially sensitive on this. To be fair to us, the consumers, nutritionists spent, 100 years saying eat meat. And that's because the poor 100 years ago hardly ate any. They couldn't afford it because it was so expensive. And what we've done is turn the animals into something so cheap I'm of the age, I was born in 1948. I was 71 yesterday, in fact. And in 1949, the first intensive poultry system came in to Britain, brought from America. And the man who brought it in, by the way, funded the right-wing think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs. The meat industry has always had a rather tricky relationships to politics. Stapleton, who was the great god of British soil scientists, by the way, who flirted with fascism. Still got a knighthood at the end of it. We basically, I'm not going to steal Pamela Mason, my colleague's thunder in her lectures tomorrow. Pam and I wrote a book, came out 2 years ago, called Sustainable Diets, but where we discuss a lot of these things, and Pamela will talk much more about this. But I'll flag some of it. And Pamela and I agree, we actually have got to have a system where British food, and I thought Zero Carbon Britain got into this in the final reports. I really supported it. Paula's nodding. It was terrific work. I reread it actually for my book the other day. It's really fabulous work you did here. We've got to actually have a new framework for what is a good diet. If the Churchillians want to do anything, well, we could do with a bit of wartime thinking about rationing, actually. And setting guidelines of what is good. So, what do we need to do? I think we've got to rethink what is a good diet. We've got to reorient the food system. We're going to have to change food culture. We've got to therefore tackle the lock-ins. What's the resistance? That's the point I'm planting, the question I'm planting in your heads. And the difficulty is the British voted narrowly to get out of Europe, thinking that somehow out of Europe is going to be dead easy. Forget it. The reality is we are in a multi-level world now. Wales, England, Scotland, Northern Ireland. Britain is not Britain, actually. The UK is not UK. It's a fragmented structure for very good reasons politically, but not enough in my view. In my book, I'm going to be arguing we need to take that further to have a much more decentralized, radical regionalism. But even if we leave the European Union on March the 30th, 80 days from now, actually, we go into the WTO, where we negotiate with 166 countries. 166. So we're saying we didn't want to negotiate with 27, where we're a very big player, hugely influential. We'd rather be a small player up against the United States and China and India, who'll eat us for breakfast. And indeed, the Secretary of State for Commerce for the US, Wilbur Ross, gave a speech a year and a half ago in which he said, if you British think you're going to keep European high food standards on animal welfare, additives, nutrition labeling things, think again, you're not going to have it. And we wrote from our centre and Sussex Sprue, Eric Millstone, who's the external examiner on your masters here, Eric and I wrote a paper with Terry Marsden at Cardiff looking at hormones and looking at the use of chlorination in cleaning up chicken as an example. And the one thing that shows up in focus groups of what has the British public found to have changed in the last 2 years, actually chlorinated chicken comes up very quickly. Well, that was us, because we know actually things like that really matter to people. They might be a right-winger or a left-winger, but they all bother about what they eat. And no one wants to eat chlorine with their chicken. Well, actually, you'll get it with your salad as well, because the US allows it on 6 foods. So there we go. It's going to be very interesting. But the point here, point number 5, is whatever we think, we're in a multi-level world. And running away from Europe is running away from reality, and we're going to hit it in a big way. I bet I'm the only person in this room who spent 7 years negotiating at the GATT. Anyone else? Not often does anyone even know what the GATT is. The GATT is now the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Forgive me. Okay, now, that's the preamble. What's Brexit? Well, actually, this is really for the students. All sorts of briefings on food and Brexit we've done. If you want to have a look at them, they're at the Food Research Collaboration. that we put together with other universities. There are now 660 people around Britain, both academics and civil society. It was a network we put together funded by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation called the Food Research Collaboration. So lots of briefings are put on there, like on Northern Ireland and so on. Some of these hit the headlines, front pages of newspapers on food security one, and the hormones and animal welfare ones didn't. But there's a big overview paper that we published at Spru at Sussex, which is where the chlorinated stuff first came out, and then we wrote another paper. So if you want to look for the students, go and look at the FRC website. Well, I actually had to do a briefing the other day, and this is the one slide from it. What does Brexit raise? I've kind of raised it in bits here, but let's do it very fast. It raises questions of supply. We wrote a report called Feeding Britain, which the government first denied, said there's not a problem, we don't need to stockpile, because we said we need to be stockpiling because there's really serious problems. And then 2 days later, they admitted they were planning for stockpiling. Well, we knew that because that's why we'd written the report. We're quite well informed, actually. But there's a problem. For the last 40 years, Britain's food system, like all rich countries, has become a just-in-time system. There is no stockpiling, there is no storage. In fact, there's 3 to 5 days storage on average, maximum. We went into World War II with the capacity to have 2 months of stockpiling. Even so, that doesn't feed a population for 12 months, which is why Lord Woolton, when he was appointed Minister of Food at the end of 1939, it was such a shambles. Churchill put him in, rightly, about one of the good things he did. And Woolton bought illegally the entire Canadian wheat crop. Did you hear me there? The entire Canadian wheat crop. And if the Germans hadn't been so incompetently facing only eastwards, they would, thinking about facing eastwards, they could have wiped Britain out within 3 months, as everyone knew. But luckily they didn't. We've got a labour problem. Already vets are leaving. Almost all the vets in abattoirs, which regulate meat, so you can produce as many Welsh blacks as you like in Wales, but they ain't going to be regulated and approved by vets because most of them are Spanish and most of them are going home. Horticulture is very important to me. I work on horticulture. 80,000 workers come from the EU to work on British farms in horticulture. The British government has ended the SAWS, Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme, 2 years ago. 3 years ago. 4 years ago now, forgive me. Assuming that there'd be an endless supply of cheap EU migrant labour. It got rid of them, and now they're going away. And they've started a SAWS scheme again that allowed only 2,500 in. So I can tell you the horticulture industry is saying, how are we going to pick it? We can grow, but we won't be able to pick. Well, who's going to do the picking? Costs? Well, food prices went up 15% because of sterling going down. Public confidence. We've had this 30 years of experience in Britain of public being quite nervous about food. It's not at the moment, but we don't want to add to that. We have got real problems about health standards, chlorinated chickens, hormones, and so on. We've got this problem of 41% coming through the EU, 30% directly, and 11% from EU negotiated trade. And we've got this problem of food standards. Anyone here heard of Codex Alimentarius Commission? Yeah, a few nodded heads, I'd expect that here. This is the World Food Standards body that sets baseline standards for food. We'll be one of 167 countries as part of that, and we haven't negotiated except through the EU there for 20 years. So we've got no experience. What's happened in the last 60, 70 years, in my lifetimes? Well, we've joined the EU. We used to fund our farmers with deficiency payments. If food went too low, we then paid them a baseline, sort of a welfare safety net. When we joined the EU, we joined the Common Agricultural Policy. The Common Agricultural Policy initially paid people to produce, so it subsidized production. But over the last 30 years has changed away from that. Actually now 20% of all EU subsidies go to the environment. And the other 80%, now going down to 75%, are actually supporting production but are not paying people for production. And Mr. Gove's agricultural bill just says, from 2021 we'll pay people for environmental land management. And we're saying, food? Farmers not to grow food? No one wants to eat anymore. Very good, actually. I was on the Government Foresight Committee on Obesity. We wanted people to have less food, actually, but I don't think this is the right way to go about it. We've joined 35 institutions which underpin food. They're the hidden infrastructure that when people voted, they weren't told. I don't blame anyone who voted out. They didn't know that the European Food Safety Authority helps the moment something goes wrong in food in Britain, it's tracked and traced across all the supply chains, and the EU sets, and that's us as part of it, sets system of traceability and so on. That goes. It's gone on March the 30th. So we've got a very interesting situation. I wanted to retire, I'll be very honest. My lovely wife is here. She wanted me to retire too. But we agreed this was the most exciting and interesting time for a professor of food policy in 70 years. This is astonishing. We've got things that have now come out. We wrote the reports that brought out the fact that if you have inspection at Dover, where British people didn't realise that 30% of its food comes through Dover. And if you have 2-minute inspection randomly on 1 in 1,000 wagons, within 24 hours you've got a 20-mile tailback. And Mr. Grayling, the Transport Minister for England, on Sunday did a trial of 150 wagons at Manton Airfield in Kent to see whether or not, if you let them out, whether it would create a logjam. It's 10,000 wagons a day is the reality. 10,000 wagons a day. This is 1/5 of all wagons on British food, on British roads is food. 1/5 of every wagon. People don't realize it. Okay, we want a more decentralized food system where you don't just do it by leaving the EU on March the 30th with no plan, which is what we're doing. This is incompetence of a level of politics that we haven't seen for decades. Very interesting for academics. The most important thing is the second bullet point. How many people here realize food is run on a just-in-time system? Yeah, I would expect that, but not all of you should put up with it. I want a country where everyone knows that's what it is. When you pay your bill, you're not paying your bill, you're reordering the next consignment. It's the storage is on the motorway. Think of it like that, and that's the situation. Our report on Northern Ireland, they'd begun, and to its great credit, the Select Committee on Northern Ireland, and also to its credit, the Afra Committee, had recognised that Northern Ireland is a very, very delicate politics in food. Northern Ireland produces meat and dairy. That's its economy, basically. That and tourism, a bit. But what no one had realised till our report came out is actually Northern Ireland imports exactly the same amount. Literally 680,000 tonnes of food a year goes into Northern Ireland from 3 retailers. And it goes through Holyhead and a little bit through Belfast from Heysham. And those trucks that you see on the A55 going into Holyhead, they're feeding not just Northern Ireland, but Southern Ireland. God damn it. Wow. The incompetence of our leaders is beggaring belief that they didn't think about this or even take notice of it. And still some of them are saying, it doesn't matter. Let the Irish sort it out. I actually feel very angry about that. I think it's not much makes me angry in food policy, but that does. I think it's just dreadful. How dare we do that? The labour problem, I've said this already. Okay. Now, let's think farming. Basically, in British farming, it's kept alive by subsidies. You probably don't know, but I do. The CAP subsidy to Britain at the moment is about 3.8, 3.9 billion a year. Okay? Anyone tell me how much money British farming got from farming last year? 9.4? 9.4 billion. So this 9.4. Subsidy, in other words, is about 35% of its income. The subsidy is about 35% of its income. This is a study, actually, it's DEFRA's figures released last year, by the FT. 2 in 5, their estimate is 2 in 5 British farms would be making losses without subsidies. Actually, some estimates that I've been seeing in the Brexit work we've been doing is something like 3 in 5 British farms will go bust within 2 years of leaving the EU. So knowing and seeing that, Mr. Gove was very clever and said, well, we'll carry this on. We'll keep the subsidies going till 2021, and then we start tapering them down. As one of his advisors told me, don't worry, Tim, he'll be gone by then. I think he meant to be Prime Minister, by the way. So this is actually very serious. And the meat-producing farmers are heavily affected by subsidies. Not many farmers are making incomes of over 50,000. Anderson's report, this is the one that just came out, forgive me. Anderson's outlook for 2019. Here it is, this is 1993 to 2019. The actual support from the CAP is this red line. The TIF figures, these for those of you who are economists on this, these are what we call the TIF figures, the total income from farming produced every year. What you see is actually, in fact, farming here was doing quite well. This was the heydays of the CAP, basically 1980s, 1990s. And basically, we brought the overproduction under control. Now what you see here is actually British farming is so heavily dependent upon subsidies. So if we start reducing those 2021, we're in difficulties. Now, to take stock, where are we? What we should be doing is stuff on the left. What we're actually doing is on the right. Read it to allow me to drink some water. There are things happening, but not enough is the picture I'm trying to give you. I mean, some of these, we could say, Pamela will say, I'm sure tomorrow, and I would say, in our book certainly says, there's oodles of depth of why we should be going towards more sustainable diets, low impact, healthy, etc. But actually, Britain, in this great study done by a Brazilian-led team, actually, of looking at all the countries across Europe, the UK ate the highest percentage of ultra-processed foods. So we're actually doing the exact opposite of what we should be doing. Why does the EU matter in that picture? That's, if you like, that slide is the complexity. I will talk a little bit later about, the money flows. I should just draw your attention to that one. Anyone tell me how much money British consumers spend on food in a year? 7%. As a percentage, that's good actually. It's about 11% of disposable income on average. In cash terms, food and drink, we spend 204 billion a year. Actually, food, about 130 billion. Just food, not soft drinks, not confectionery. Now, farming gets 9 billion of that. So farming's getting about 7% of the money. Do you want me to say that again? So people who grow it are getting 7% of the money. Catering gets 30% of the gross value added. Sorry, 30% of the gross value added. 31 billion gross value added. So it's getting about 22% of the money. Retailing about the same. Manufacturing, slightly less. Logistics, trucks, makes about as much money as farming. So there's something really interesting going on in terms of money flows, which has never happened in human history before. For me, that's a really big issue. And actually I don't know about you, but I think we should be growing more food here. I think a country that produces, well, it depends which figures you use, Britain produces about 50% of its food. By value terms, about 60% of its food by value. I think we should be growing more food. Not because I'm a little Englander, it's not ideology. It's just because globally everyone's got to use their land better. Different rules, the sustainability rules kick in. Actually, UK production is falling. Quite dramatically. Where's the food industry in all of this? Well, I can tell you 3 years ago they didn't want to know when we talk a lot to the food industry in our centre. We don't take food industry money, but we talk to them all the time. Whereas ruthlessly, my replacement, my successor as the director of our centre, Corinna Hawkes, is, if it's possible to be harder line than me, she is. No money at all, but talk all the time. We want to know what they're doing, why they're doing, so we can be highly critical and independent and so on, but know what we're talking about. I think I know quite a lot about the food industry. This is in one slide my summary. Farming is completely split. Farming voted to leave the European Union, but is entirely dependent upon the EU. So ideology ruled over the head, which you can say, great, this is very honourable and great, but the food manufacturing was overwhelmingly Remain, but kept quiet. It was probably the industry which gained most from this Mrs. Thatcher's single market. Mrs. Thatcher pushed the single market, by the way. Retail was solidly for Remain, but didn't want to speak about it because it feeds people whether you're a fascist or a communist, a green or an anti-green. Food service was split, but now isn't because it's probably, in numbers terms, the most dependent on EU migrant labour. They have, and I thought very hard about this with my colleagues, those 5 sub-bullet points. I think what the food industry generally agrees on is that it's been quiet in public. I mean, I told you what the head of Tesco said because I'm quite well informed, but I've said it enough in public, and this isn't public anyway, to quote him. But I can tell you others said the same. The politicians did not want to know. If there's a sub-theme of my talk today, it's that we have a problem as the British consuming public, that our politicians are illiterate about food. And that's our fault. Caroline Lucas isn't illiterate about food. 1 or 2 members of the EFRA committee aren't. 1 or 2 members of the Welsh Assembly government aren't. 1 or 2 Scottish government aren't. But not many others. And yet everyone eats. If I had one slide, I have shown this to politicians. This is my latest version of the slide. I think this is our choice. This is what we British people have got to decide. What do we want from our food system? It's this. Do we want to be Atlanticist? Have food from not oranges from Spain or Greece, but from Florida? Do you want not beef from Wales, not fed grain? Or do you want it from feedlots in CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, as the Americans call them? Do we want to be globalist? We don't care a toss where our food comes from, we'll get it from anywhere. Do we want to be neo-colonial? Read some of the Tory party and it's pretty clear they do, and indeed some in Labour too. They don't mind where it comes from as long as the land is cheap and labour is cheap. So we'll have chicken from Brazil you can get 5 chicken cheaper from Brazil to Britain than 5 chickens grown down the road here. Because land and labour are cheap and standards are lower. So you'll find lots of food companies wanting to get from Thailand or Brazil, setting them off against each other. This is a globalist approach. You've got what I think is very interesting. There's what I've called the outer European. We don't want Spain or Portugal or Greece or Italy. We'll have Morocco, Tunisia, Israel, Lebanon, Turkey. It's outer European. First place Boris Johnson went to as foreign secretary was Turkey. Great-grandson of a Turk, voted out. You've got New European. Most of the Labour Party is New European. Is in favour of staying in Europe, wants a reformed Europe, thinks we've got to sort out Europe, but there's no point walking away from it because they're just over the channel. And you've got what I would think Cat, and certainly people like me, I'm from that generation where we think we want more bioregional, actually, where possible. You're not going to get olive production in Wales or indeed in Britain. But there's a lot that you could grow bioregionally that we're not. These are very different visions of what the food system is in the next 30 years. They're all feasible, entirely feasible, but they're all very different. And I think that's the debate we ought to be having. In fact, what's happened is Brexit has created these divisions. Here we are in Wales. I've many times been on advisory committees in front of the Senedd about what should Wales do. Wales is in a very tricky position. It's tiny compared to the giant neighbour next door. It's indeed fed by the giant neighbour next door. We've got a real problem of the devolved administrations. We've got a real problem of sourcing and so on. Actually, the only thing that Mr. Gove, stung by our criticisms, he asked the restaurateur, Henry Dimbleby, Eton and Oxford, nice guy, I like him a lot, who did a great job on school meals. He's asked him to do a review of food. Well, it's not going to come out before March the 29th. Let me just tell you, because I met him the other day. He hasn't even started, because he doesn't know what we're doing after March the 29th. And you can't decide what sort of food system you want until you know what framework you're in. So, okay. Let me now go very quickly to remind you I've been trying to talk about the politics we're in about food and Brexit, but weaving it with the sustainability agenda. Let me now just very rapidly, I'm going to go through these very fast indeed. There is actually where's Pamela? Are you using this tomorrow? Yeah, I'll leave it. The debate Pamela and I are involved in is what we call sustainable diets. Somehow we've got to address consumption, to shift consumption in a way that links nutrition with biodiversity, with water consumption, with all the ecosystems, infrastructure and social equality and so on. This is actually a very old debate, and that's what this slide is. It really begins with Malthus. Can we feed the world? Well, we've proved Malthus wrong for the last 200 years, but at great cost. That's what we now know, at great cost. But in the last 10 years, the beginnings of some thinking has emerged about, can we do something about sustainable diets? And the answer is, yes, we can do things. And the Eat-Lancet Commission report I've put at the bottom is called Food in the Anthropocene. It's out on the 17th of January. The big news has been this, the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 development goals. Food is in 12 of them. There are 167 or so targets in them. Food is in 70 of them. There was a recognition at the UN level, compared to the Millennium Development Goals, that food and nutrition and sustainability of diets is critical. That's good. And it gets very detailed. I've just put some here from a paper Pamela and I wrote. You know, what the Sustainable Development Goal number 2 is to end poverty. Well, pigs can fly. But actually, when you look at it, there is a huge amount that's significant about food and diet in that. Wherever you look in the SDGs, you have to deal with food. And that message has actually really got in at the UN level. So at the top-down level, it's percolating down in a really very exciting way. For old boring farts like me or Paul, we didn't have this 20 years ago. Not at all. Recognizing that climate change and biodiversity and diet are all part of a food system is fantastic, actually. We have to say so. And the Paris Climate Change Accord was fantastic. Big commitments from the British government. Has it translated those into diet, Paul? No, it hasn't. And that's my frustration. That's what it should be doing, instead of which it's not doing anything about Brexit. When we should be, if we did want Brexit, we should be making Brexit for this. And we're not. My voice goes high. Calm down. I think you've got the point. Ironically, at the EU level, things have got very, very interesting just when we're trying to walk away from it. It's astonishing. I'm on, as my lovely wife knows, I'm on 3 committees at the EU level, which are moving frameworks for a comprehensive food policy, frameworks for sustainable diets, and so on. You couldn't invent it. We're just walking away from where the thinking is now beginning to think, holy Moses, we in Germany, the Germans have got to eat less meat. The German government is beginning to debate reducing less meat. The Netherlands government last year, in September 2018, issued guidelines to reduce meat consumption by 50% for certain age groups of males. And it got a lot of publicity. And we're walking away from this discourse, faffing about, not even deciding what we want. So there are really interesting things going on at the EU level, which we could talk about. The students, we can talk about it. All the European countries have been doing very interesting things. It's not all perfect at all. Sweden was the first. It did fantastic work on sustainable diets, then was made to reduce it and remove it, but then came back and said, no, we're going to do it, and it did it another way. Meanwhile, we're wanting to hook up with the United States, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove et al., were the country which rejected its scientists' advice on changing the dietary guidelines for Americans to include environmental criteria. That's the country that half the British cabinet thinks should feed us. You couldn't invent it. Here you go, Paul, you're at the top there. Civil society has been doing really interesting stuff. I pay tribute. Here we are at CAT. CAT was fantastic. Zero Carbon Britain. Not just a quick one-off raid and pillage, but 10 years solid work. But it's actually spread around the world. The Sustainable Food Cities group in Britain is now 60 cities, 66 cities, I think. I'm on the London Food Board, which is advising Mayor Khan, Sadiq Khan. Used to be Liz's and my MP in South London, where we live. We have a London food plan. It's fantastic. It's a matrix management system. We have a Brexit subcommittee. The Mayor of London is beginning to think about what the British government isn't beginning to think about. There are some really interesting things going on. The Milan Urban Food Policy Pact in 2015, 150 cities have signed on to that, a commitment at the city level to try to do something about sustainability. A lot of it's air, don't get me wrong, a lot of it's air, but a lot of it is opening space for civil society to do things as well. Companies, I've told you our centre is known as critics of the food companies, but we talk with them a lot. We want to know what they're doing. Actually, some very interesting things have been going on with companies. You know, I think, Barilla, the biggest pasta company in the world, did the inverted pyramid, which I think was brilliant. Tesco, I'm not a great fan of Tesco. A third of all food in Britain comes through Tesco. But wow, it's taking a lead worldwide on SDG 12.2 on reducing food waste. And it's doing it seriously. PepsiCo, probably one of my 2 least favorite companies on the planet. I wish it would go bust tomorrow. It did fantastic work here in Britain on reducing its carbon footprint. You can't say these things aren't happening. But the problem is they're all doing it for their own products. They're not shifting the diet. They're saying, you eat PepsiCo crisps, we'll deal with you. But those of you who don't eat PepsiCo crisps, we're not interested in. Actually, we've all got to move. So it's this shift I started my lecture with. We've got a shift from thinking individual choice to thinking population-wide impacts. Is the great food transformation emerging, I'm asking? No, I don't think it is. But we've got some interesting experimentation going on. And this is from Pamela's in my book. Our argument is, actually, if we wanted to encapsulate what we've got to do, it's this in one slide. Pamela and I based it on the work that the Sustainable Development Commission did. And basically, we've got to think about the food system against those 6 headings, and then under them, the criteria that they represent. So there's a framework that's possible. And this is what's been written into the new EU EESC, the European Economic and Social Committee report, which will come out in March this year. This kind of thinking, comprehensive, what we call multi-criteria thinking. I've said that. Okay, let me just give you some data. We know that, Pamela, do you use this? This is Marco Springman's. Yeah, okay, but Pamela will say this sort of stuff. Looking across the world, the deaths that we could avoid if we followed WHO and World Cancer Research Fund advice would be very significant in the developed countries and across different regions in different ways. We know there's not one size fits all that matters, but we get huge deaths. That's deaths avoided. That's because in the rich world, we're dying from over and malconsumption. In the poor world, they die from still underconsumption. But they're catching us up very fast indeed. This is from a very interesting study done by Mike Berners-Lee, whom I like immensely, the brother of the father of the web. So it's not Tim, but it's Mike at Lancaster. And this is a very nice study. Pamela, did I send you this? Have you got this? This is a great study. This is what the world is on this table. The students, you can look at this. Basically, it's saying the ideal diet broadly is this: X amount of fruit and veg, reducing sugar and sweeteners, vegetable oils in moderation, and meat and dairy sort of down from what, say, Europe. Look at that. Europe 1035. That's basically 60% of what we should be eating. So if you look at Europe, this is UN Europe, which includes Russia, by the way. We're here. If you look at Africa, they're here. North Africa. Basically, the world doesn't eat all the same. It's a very obvious statement to make, but it's really important. Different messages about sustainable diets and sustainable food systems have to be tailored for different countries. We're all in a different starting point. And this sort of study is really helpful, and I think you'll find the Eat-Lancet report extremely useful on this. This is one of my favorite slides. It's actually old. It's from PLOS One, but no one has repeated this study, which I wish they would, but it took a lot of time. It came out 7 years ago. It was basically looking at where are the food flows? Where is the power in the food system? And these are all, can you see it enough? These are all countries. So here's, Oman, here's Togo, here's New Zealand, here's Portugal, here's Saudi Arabia. I can't reach higher. There's Egypt, But in the middle, Germany, Netherlands, France, Italy, UK, USA. China is just there. That's China. In terms of power, Europe is very important, and the US, in terms of dominating the food system. The problem is, part of our influence is because we're allied with this lot. It's as though you took California out and Florida out. That's what Brexit is doing. I put this up simply to remind myself to say all of this has impact on biodiversity. All of it. And this is, you won't be able to see this, but I put this in because it's for the students really, and it's really worth looking at later. I won't talk about it much, but let me just explain. These are all, excuse me. This is from Mike Berners-Lee's paper again. He looked at all big classes of nutrients. Oh God, I keep hitting the wrong button, excuse me. And looked at what's grown to what's consumed. So each of these goes from grown to consumed, grown to consumed, grown to consumed, grown to consumed. What you notice in all of them, this is protein, this is vitamin A, this is zinc in food, this is iron, this is energy, so calories. And there are pages of calculations done on this. It's really interesting. Where does the food get lost? Now this takes us back, Paul, this is back to where you and I started. This is sort of 1950s hippy-dippy stuff. We've got to stop waste. Actually, the message of this is so 1960s. It's basically, can we shorten the supply chains to reduce the waste? To me, this is the ultimate argument for shorter supply chains. Everyone does something to food and denatures it. The longer the chain, the more you're denaturing it. Doesn't mean to say short chains can't denature and reduce and lose vitamins and nutrients. They can. I want to begin to wrap up by saying, okay, here we are in a beautiful area of Britain. Beautiful even by Welsh standards. What are we going to do about biodiversity? In policy terms, I spent couple of years with FAO and others and Biodiversity, the CGIAR group, thinking about this. And this slide and the next slide, summarize what I think the policy options are. Do we create parks? Should we just close off sheep and cattle from all of Snowdonia? Just rewild it. Do we do one stage further and actually not just rewild, but actually protect it? Just say these are, George Stapleton was in favour of parks. Parks to protect biodiversity, protect nature. Actually, he believed in it for people in cities to come and get healthy with. Part of the fascist thinking. So biodiversity in seas of pollution. You don't change the pollution, but you have a biopark so you get lots of visitors. Do you rewild it? Do you, as the FAO and Biodiversity, we concluded, well, actually the best way to protect biodiversity is to eat it. Because if you eat it, you'll look after it. And you increase the range of foods that we eat. You don't just have one variety of tomato, you have 200 varieties of tomato. And if you're growing 200 varieties of tomato, they're more resilient to pests and all sorts of things, and all the eco kind of arguments kick in. Do you intensify mass production to allow biodiversity on the edge of the field? That's what the EU has paid for. It paid people to have borders around the edge of fields to have sort of wildness at the edge? Do you commercialize it? GM has been very good at that, actually. I could see the arguments of that, actually. You can take 5 varieties of potato and inject them into one potato. So you're intensifying biodiversity in one plant. Interesting. In food, that's certainly happening. Do we do mass engagement? Say, well, it's all up to markets. Let people decide. If they don't want biodiversity, let them have one variety of potato. You go into Tesco, you get 3 varieties of apple. If you go to Waitrose, you get 6 varieties of apples. If you go to Booth, you get 9. We've got 2,300 varieties of apple. Do we do it by tax? Should we tax monoculture? I can see that as very interesting, actually. I've suggested that to a few MPs. I suggested it to select committee. What do we do about it? Do we tax? So if someone wants to grow 500 acres of one variety of wheat, if I put up the figures on wheat, I should know them by heart, but I don't. Let me just invent it for a moment. I think there's about 5 varieties of wheat grown in Britain. There are a few others, but they account for about 90%, something like that. Do we tax them if they want to do that? Do we support farmers who want to grow something different? Do we ban monoculture? Whoa. This is World War II war ag, where the war agriculture committees would come and say, sorry, you've got to plough up that field and you're going to grow potatoes. Well, I've never grown potatoes on that for 200 years in our family. Sorry, you're digging it up, ploughing it up and growing potatoes. This is very interesting, because what we could do in that, I put the examples, we could say, well, we ban deforested soy products. All the vegans eating soy milk who are po-faced and think they're doing the right thing, not many of them are getting soy from nice, ethically sourced, biodiverse sources. I'm not saying that because I'm against soy. Actually, I quite like soy. What do we do about biodiversity? These are huge questions, is what we should be thinking about, instead of which we're not even thinking about food coming through a tunnel in Dover. This is Vavilov. Anyone here know about Vavilov? I'd be shocked if a few hands didn't go up here. Vavilov, the great Russian scientist, basically 9 areas, he said, we now think it's more than that, where most biodiversity comes from. The wonderful Colin Currie, who I had the pleasure of being with for a week in Frankfurt 2 years ago, and we've got a big paper coming out soon. This is Colin's work with his team in Kenya. Basically mapping, students, you can look at this later, it's a fabulous paper. Just the biodiversity in areas. Look, here's Europe. We've got so little compared to, other parts of the world. But nonetheless, we've got fantastic biodiversity compared to, what we used to have. I'm going to leave that. No, I'll show you this, because I referred to it earlier. We've basically reduced, as countries get richer, they eat more and they eat a wider range of foods because they can afford to buy it and not just have what survives locally. So localism is actually not very good nutritionally. If you just ate what was grown around here, you wouldn't live very well. It made a lot of difference for the people of Wales to start getting food from other than Wales. Could get bananas and pineapples and fruit grown when we can't grow it or keep it. Are you reading this? This is a summary I put together a few years ago. There's a huge decline. There was a rise in biodiversity of what we eat and then a decline. How can we reverse that in diet? I think I've said all of this. Do you know all of this? Do you know Rockstrom's work? Yeah, one or two nods. For those who don't, this is the co-chair of our Eat-Lancet Report. Basically looking at the world, you know, there are certain planetary functions that we depend upon, climate, you know, things that are being done to the climate and to the world, novel entities, you know, GM is one, but, you know, nanotechnology, all these sort of things. There are lots of calculations that have been made, and basically the argument is that we're pushing the world beyond the safe operating space in here, in yellow or green. Green is the best. Biosphere integrity, I've put it up here, if you don't know what E/MSI means, you know, it's biodiversity intactness index and extinctions per million species. Basically, all the specialists agree biodiversity is already hopelessly damaged. We cannot reverse the damage we've done. One of the areas we've got to address, what we've got left, is eating. So actually, back to the slides back here, in the FAO discussions I was privileged to be in, I realized, to my complete surprise, eating biodiversity is really very important indeed. We've got to make that a bigger part of what we do. When I go and talk to chefs, I work a lot with chefs, and I go and talk to my friend Raymond Blanc, for example, I'm saying, Raymond, I don't want you to grow just one variety. And he has 1,000 apples in his orchard. He's really listened. He's got 1,000 apples in his orchard that are then fed. This is elite chefs. Okay, so he's got 15 acres he can grow food on for his restaurant. But that, I think, is really, really important. Now, we can do that at the domestic level. 40 years ago, cancer people were saying, eat different colors, and they were laughed at. And now we're beginning to think, actually, the different colors are different varieties. Eat your greens, World War II. Pretty good thing, actually. We know that now. Okay, so where are we? Water. Have any of you seen this before? This is a favorite slide of mine. It's old, but it's 15 years old now, but it still stands. This is the wonderful duo who started after my hero, Tony Allen of SOAS and King's, doing work on what Tony Allen called virtual water. We've got to think about food as water. And this is a Dutch study. This team here, these two, ended up doing 25,000 different foods and assessing them for the amount of water that is embedded in them. So one of the things we've got to do is think about embedded water in food. And this is a beef burger in the Netherlands. A 150-gram burger in the Netherlands has actually used 2,400 litres of embedded water. And here's where the water has been used. Growing the grain, irrigating the grass, cows drinking it, washing the udders to keep them going, etc. One cow, blah, blah. And when you look at different products, I don't think I've put it in, no I haven't, but actually rice, you know, rice it makes beef look nothing. So don't quote me, but it's something like 1 kilo of rice is 3,600 litres of water, and that's before you cook it. Rice is probably the most climate change stressed crop in the planet because of water changes where rice is grown. Now, Wales, you think, oh, well, that doesn't matter. You know, in Wales, who cares? We've got Welsh blacks eating it. Well, it depends if you feed them the grain. Depends how you feed them. So we've got to think very differently about our food, not just is it beef or is it chicken, but is it embedded water or is it high carbon or low carbon? This is multi-criteria thinking. This is what this master's of yours is all about, Saskia. You don't need me to tell you. I'm telling the students, but they know anyway. This is, you know, actually we've been talking a lot about ecosystems, but, you know, food is the biggest killer on the planet now. Food is the biggest killer on the planet. Here's the Lancet. These are DALYs. You won't speak DALYs. I speak DALYs. Disability-adjusted life years. A a thing developed by Chris Murray, who's on the Eat-Lancet Commission that I'm on. Comes out next week. This is the latest global review of the sources of disability lost adjusted life years. So this isn't dying from causes. This is how is the quality of your life reduced sort of impact. So this is qualitative impact, not just morbidity, mortality, but it's morbidity. So, we know, well, basically, that's tobacco. Tobacco is astonishing. Child and maternal malnutrition is a mega source of premature death and bad existing. But food is involved in 12 of those 16. Give me that, we'll do that. Yeah, if there's one argument, I think even the most idiotic meat producers I've ever met, and I've met a few, but I've met an awful lot of very clever meat producers, so I'm not being nasty, recognize this problem of antimicrobial resistance. How many people here have been saved by antibiotics? How many times? My life twice. Yeah. David's mine twice.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I might have got away with having one arm removed, but then everyone...
Yeah, mine too. We'll swap. I've got a very nice scar here. That in India, the scar goes from there to there. When I was 3, I did that, putting my arm through a window, and my mother strapped me to her back and ran for 2 miles to the doctor in the hill station. We were up in the hills outside Bombay, and he wanted to cut my arm off there and then. Said he'll be dead. There you go. That usually makes people go quiet. You don't know what the NHS has till farmers take it away from you. That's what antimicrobial resistance is doing. Farming is absolutely disgraceful. Those animals kept in that conditions because of being fed prophylactic. And of course in the US this is allowed. So the polychlorinated chicken is not just that, but increasing antimicrobial resistance. The US resisted the 1950s reports onwards. Soil, this is the latest big review by the EU on soil. We think we've got lots of soil, nice soil. Actually, we've got real trouble down here. This is where we get our fruit and veg in the winter from, in Spain, bits of Italy. But actually, we're not so damn good here either. I'm going to leave that. Okay, I think I'm ending now. Where have we got? This is a very big cut story. I've been trying to follow your faces. I think you're interested. It's a big story I'm giving. I apologize, but I don't apologize. We've got to get our heads round this. That's why I come. I'm not coming for the money. I'm coming because I think this is up to us. We have to have a debate about this. I think point number 1, so this is, I asked you at the beginning of this lecture, would you be thinking about what would you do if you had to meet the Prime Minister or the head of the Welsh Government? Don't blather about, say, what my granny said or this. I want to know, what do you want her or him to do? Okay? This is me doing 5 points. I sat in my study at home and thought, okay, these are my 5. The first is, I think we've got to get a grip of the politics. And that basically means all of this. We're nowhere near. And what Brexit is doing is keeping us nowhere near. Until we either stay in or go out, we've got to, the moment whatever happens, we've got to start getting a grip. You've got to be hammering your AMs, hammering them until they start talking about this. Luckily, my MP in London is a doctor, and she's fantastic. She gets it. We have to work on these people, support them, help write speeches, pummel them, encourage them. This is a political task for all of us, whatever your politics. We've got very strange alliances happening. John Redwood, not my favourite politician, no, Sir John Redwood, he wants more food grown here. Michael Gove is silent about food. So these are two right-wing, anti-Europe, pro-Brexiters taking totally different positions. So we've got a very tricky politics to sort out. Great food transformation 2. I think we mustn't say there's one thing we've got to do. There's no one answer, Saskia. If anyone says, oh, well, GM will be the answer or vegan diets will be the answer, just show them to the door. Say, sorry, it's more complicated than single answers. It's a multi-criteria food system. It's a multiple solution set of answers we've got to have. We began to do it actually in Britain. Of all things, the world was extremely interested in what we began to do in 2008 to 10, at the end of the last Labour government. Something really interesting happened because they were shaken rigid by the banking crisis that made food prices go up worldwide double. And they thought, holy Moses, actually this is affecting us, not just Africa. And to their credit, they began to engage. Hilary Benn, a vegetarian actually, Secretary of State at DEFRA in London, started to do it and started talking to Wales and Scotland about it. And the programme was called Food 2030, and it was there. It had sustainable diets, more sustainable food system. It wasn't what I wanted, but wow, was it beginning something? Month number 2 of the coalition coming in, Cameron and Clegg, they stopped it. They stopped it. Month number 2. I was livid. We have to restart that. That's what the Agricultural Bill of Gove ought to be. He ought to have been talking with Wales and Scotland. He isn't. That's actually the agenda we should be doing. I think we need new institutions. For us in England, we've got to put the F back into DEFRA. I think we need a new regionalism everywhere. Here we are in Wales. I think Wales is 3 regions, actually. There's a really good case for Wales having 3 regions of Wales. England, definitely 10. Definitely. Scotland, well, the arguments there are slightly trickier, but definitely 3. We've got to have some democratic institutions which we can talk in some regional way to build on the sorts of things that you do here, but aren't just drowning in Cardiff. That Anglesey and Bangor on the North Wales coast starts thinking as it did in the 19th century, actually. We know, this is a very tricky slide, but don't worry about it, the students can look at it. We know that if you want to tackle anything, it works much better if you have multiple targets. This is a very interesting study by Van Berkel, and so a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago actually, trying to deal with antimicrobial consumption in food animals by 2030. If you just have regulations or meat reduction or target people, they have an impact, but the best is to have all of them at once. It's kind of, I've put this slide in to make that point. We know that there's no one answer to big problems. You've got to have multiple entry points to tackle it. Great food transformation 3 for the Prime Minister, I would say, it's the food economy, stupid. We've got to change land use. We've got to have more plants, fewer animals. More plants, fewer animals. We've got to grow less animals, more plants. We've got to grow more here, not grow pineapples or bananas, but, you know, it's bonkers not to be growing more soft fruit, more apples. That means thinking, how are we going to pick them? Is this a chance for something like B&Q did? Something elderly people can do? Can we build back holidays as a way of harvesting? We've got to think imaginatively. Let me put it starkly, as I've said to ministers, if there was a war, you're going to have to do this anyway. So let's just start thinking about it now. I think we need new land grant food colleges. Every county created agricultural colleges in the late 19th century. Some at the beginning of the 19th century. They were allowed to become kite and horse management and things. They need to be brought back together, and the cities having food colleges that work alongside the agricultural ones. We've got to have some imagination about what we mean by education. This is what you're doing here. But what we were talking about, it was both of you two, we were talking at dinner tonight. You know, what can we do to have a really upsurge of thinking and practice? We've got to do this. It's really important. That argument we're having about Colin Touch, this is that. Point number 4 to the Minister, I would say, well, actually, sorry, Minister, you're going to be very politically unpopular, but wow, are you going to get your sainthood? And that means tackling the elephant in the room, us, consumers. We have to do it. And I am old enough to know the tackling of AIDS that went on. And Ken Calman was fantastic. The Chief Medical Officer of England took Margaret Thatcher, a demon of a woman, sorry, a very charming, nice woman, and shook her by the scruff of the neck and said, do you want to have multiple deaths on your epitaph? And she got it. She was a scientist. Okay, she put air into ice cream. That's what she did when she worked after Oxford. Mr. Whippy, that was her legacy to the food industry. If you didn't know that, you've learned something. But Thatcher, utterly to her credit, poured money at HIV and AIDS. This is a woman who thought gays were not very nice people and really this might be God answering them. And she backed the biggest advertising campaign ever in British public health history. We need to do something massive to start shifting diet. All sorts of things have got to happen. Caroline Lucas last week at Oxford very, very bravely proposed a meat tax. Actually, all she was doing was following rightly the leadership my friend Mike Rayner at Oxford and Marco Springman, whose paper I put up earlier, have shown. If we don't deal with meat in one way, we've got to deal with it other ways. I'll leave that. Because we know the students can look at that. This I put in. This is Laura's paper from ULOT. You can look at it later. And here's the biggest conservation organization in the world, WWF, now has made diet change one of its 5 big campaigns for the world. Why? Because it knows it won't tackle biodiversity loss unless it tackles consumers destroying it. And here's it doing nutrition work, basically. And I've put the study there, which is very good indeed. This is Dave Tillman and Mike Clark. These are colleagues of mine on the Eat-Lancet. And this, I think, is my last slide. My last is, I'm a social scientist. I think ultimately you've got to have a reinvigoration of the state with different change makers. I think we've got a very interesting politics in Britain bubbling and waiting to come up of social movements about food. But we need those 4 wings to be brought together. And that's what's not happening. That's what the Tories aren't doing and Labour doesn't yet have a clue about. I think the Greens do, but they've only got 1 MP. And Plaid, yeah, a little bit. Labour in Wales, a little bit. Labour in Scotland, not much. SNP, actually more than most. The Nourish Scotland movement is really, really interesting. We've got to basically link these change makers, as I've called them. It's not happening. So that's our plug. Those are my 5 points. Now I want to know, what are yours? You've had an hour and a quarter to listen to me. I want the first person to put their hand up. If you saw the Prime Minister, or who would you like to influence, what would you want them to do? Paul. Oh, you've got to have the microphone, sorry. That's the end of my lecture, by the way. Now you talk. I stop.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Paul, say who you are.
I would really, Paul Allen, Centre for Alternative Technology, Zero Carbon Britain. I really do look forward to the moment where I am addressing you as Prime Minister. I think you'd do a damn good job. Prime Minister, I would say multi-solving reveals many different potential benefits from changes. And so we can look at social prescription, jobs, health, climate resilience. And from that multi-solving, we can map out a Marshall Plan to deliver, drawing upon the indigenous wisdom of UK agriculture and our understanding of the land and the terrain. But I think the reason that we're not seeing sense in politicians is there is the need to expose a potential corporate land grab, an asset stripping, a shock doctrine that can occur from a collapse. And all you've got to do is kick in the policies that will deliver a collapse. And out of that collapse, you can begin to grab lots and lots of land. Because
don't you think that's what we've got?
I think
I
there
think
may
we've
be
got
people.
the beginnings of collapse.
There may be people within the right-wing money men circle that know that basically before we had fossil fuels, soil was the pivotal thing. Oil trumped soil, but as we move away from fossil fuels, soil is the new oil. So asset grabbing and corporate takeover of land is something that I think we have to reveal and be ready to watch for that. Because
Do other people agree with that?
it may be there.
Focus on soil.
I'm not saying it is there, but I think individuals and corporate money men could make a huge amount of money out of that.
Look, I've talked to big financiers around the world in my time. Some of them get it. They get soil. But what they tend to do is buy it.
Because its value is going to go up in the future. Buy it while it's cheap, during the collapse, hold on to it, wait for its value to go, and then if you can begin to build houses on it. Where I'm living, the big landed gentry family where I grew up in Penrith is the Lowther family. They've now been part of a master plan to build 5,400 houses, doubling the population of Penrith in 20 years, at £40,000 per plot. 5,400 times 40 is an awful lot of money for the landed gentry.
The issue for me there is I'm not against house building, it's on what soil. For me, that is the issue. One of the things that troubles me about soil is that, does everyone know we have a grading system in the UK? Wales still has it. When I was a government commissioner, I tried to get the soil stuff up the agenda and didn't win, but it came up later. Grade 1 land still is not protected. You can build a motorway and build where the Lowthers are wanting to build around Penrith is good land, actually.
It's good land.
It's good land. It's riverbed land.
But I think the most important thing for me, and I'll shut up now, is looking at the positive solutions, because at least 50% of all we say should focus on the positive solutions, and I think it's the multi-solving approach that in this very complex situation can reveal an area that we can move into, because we're delivering social prescription, we're delivering more resilient food supply, we're creating more employment locally, and it's that multi-solving lens that I think we need to develop. Thank you.
I agree with that. Okay, next one. I want more ideas. I've done a lot of work. You've all been sitting there. What would you tell the Prime Minister?
I would like the Prime Minister to show some courage and to address what I think are probably some very powerful vested interests at a global level. I think we've probably got a reactionary fossil fuel lobby and people who want to remove regulation globally that are pushing an agenda very quietly behind the scenes, possibly slightly subversively on social media, as we've seen with some of the Brexit campaigns, and also in the US, possibly also in Brazil, where these very, very wealthy organisations want to remove the food standards regulation more generally in order that they can sell their products more readily.
So what would you
globally.
do? The Labour Party has put down measures to legislate that food standards should be kept at the same level.
I think that...
Is that the sort of thing you want?
I think it's bigger than that. I think that we need governments to call out these parties who pay for government support. So lobbyists, but on a bigger scale, where people are funding things. We've got people like, is it Claire Perry, the energy minister, going to meetings with companies that support fracking. I think there needs to be a recognition of how much money is behind a lot of politics nowadays, a lot of the lack of transparency. And if politicians could call that out and make people aware of it,
some of the political theorists think that the one way to deal with that is, or begin to address it, is to actually control lobbying more.
Possibly, yes.
What we've done is we've Americanized our civil service. We've reduced our civil service, actually. By the way, I'm sure you've noticed, civil service has had to be increased to deal with Brexit. DEFRA sacked 700 people, but has employed 650 now to deal with Brexit. And we still haven't got a food policy, because they're all having to deal with Brexit planning that they then can't deal with because the ministers can't agree what they want them to plan about. That's what's going on. But the point you're raising is a really important one, which is, how do we have decision making? Well, it ought to be parliamentary. It ought to be through openness rather than covertness. You're right. I'm genuinely uncertain how that can be dealt with. A friend of mine, Jeff Rayner, and I wrote a book on ecological public health. 7 years ago it came out. And we got into some pretty big arguments with PepsiCo about sugar and things like that, because they basically sell sugar and make money from it in the drink. But they're altering it a bit. And we got asked to meet them. And we actually ended up being asked to meet them at their PR company. We went in the staircase in a block at Westminster, in the London Borough of Westminster on Victoria Street, and we walked for 300 metres past row after row after row of young people sitting at computers. There are now 4 times more PR people in the world than there are journalists. How do we deal with that? Is your question. Has anyone got a very quick answer to that? I think you're raising a huge issue. I don't know what we do about it, but then to bring it out into the open. You're right. Transparency. Next suggestion. Great, the guy there.
I'd like the government, dear Prime Minister, I'd like you to tell the truth about the ecological crisis we've got. I'd like you to present to the nation the Rockstrom and Stefan Planetary Boundaries data and confess that the agrochemical intensive animal industry have captured our food system and tell Monsanto, Bayer, Syngenta and these big American CAFOs or feedlots, tell them to get lost and let's go back to the old ways and go back to real farming. Permaculture, agroforestry, agroecology.
Well, I like that a lot, and I'm with you. At the end of my book that I'm writing at the moment, I've written a Dear Prime Minister letter, actually. And it kind of says that. Is that your new book or the book? Yeah, new book. Yeah, when's that out? Depends when I finish it.
Cool.
It's as Pamela knows, deadlines are sometimes quite fluid with me, but I'm supposed to hand it in 2 weeks' time. Anyway, we'll see. The only thing I disagreed with you is saying get back to. I don't think, with respect, I don't think we can get back to much, actually.
Yeah, but kind of what I mean by that is reverse the worst effects of the Green Revolution, but with the modern thinking of all the modern permaculture, agroecology. Learn from the Africans. I know they're growing different crops to a certain extent, but they're doing small-scale farming there. They really understand it, and farmers need to just decouple from this farming groupthink, this NFU groupthink, this industry thinking that's led them down the garden path on agrochemicals and feedlots, and they've just been totally hoodwinked. And when this post-Brexit land grab comes, it'll be the smaller farmers will get pushed out the game, and all the aristocrats will just come in and steal their land. That's what Brexit is a Trojan horse for more land enclosures and land grabs, and lots of other things as well, but in food terms, that's what it is.
I think that might be, definitely that is, I was at a Chatham House Rule meeting where exactly that scenario viewed. Actually, it was mostly big landowners. And believe it or not, they were worried about the loss of small farmers.
Yeah, they ought to be, I think.
They were. Surprisingly, it surprised me, but they were genuinely worried about it. They said, look, if we don't have the infrastructure, it's fine for us to have big estates or big farming, big business, or East of England farming, where the productivity is very high in financial and land output terms compared to, say, here. But the entire sort of infrastructure of farming changes. I mean, one scenario we were presented, actually, funnily enough, at that same meeting, this was a year and 3/4 ago, was that, 2/3 of farming would go bust. You notice that I put up much less sober figures from the DEFRA figures, which you notice DEFRA didn't publish. The Financial Times published it. 2 in 5 farmers rely entirely on subsidy. I don't know what's going to happen on that. I think the issue of land ownership and land use is going to be very big politics. I agree with you. I think we've probably got to be more imaginative, and I think that's got to be about getting people to say, do they mind if all the small farms in Snowdonia go out of business? Well, I think, yes, it does matter, because it's about people. But what I'm as bothered about, is what do we do with the landscape? I think that does matter very much indeed. I notice you're tending to more talk about the farming. Has anyone got anything to say about catering or retailing? What do you think about retailing? Shopping? People go to work to buy a car, to go further to get the car. Do you want shopping to stay the same, just to have ecological food in Tesco? You're going to give us the answer.
No. Bouncing off what Paul said, because we wrote that report together, Raising Ambition, that talks about multi-solving. I would say to a Prime Minister to think in terms of interactions, so to increase the interfaces by which we interact with food, with farmers, with all different kinds of landscape users and appreciators. Because, by interacting with food that's not processed, we learn more about the food, we understand where it comes from and our health better, these kinds of factors. So not just at the shopping level, coming from a rural area, those interactions you have in a market with local producers, that makes their day, that makes my day, those kinds of, they are romanticized, but the interactions that can be had, they feed a much deeper connection on many levels to the whole of the food system.
Let me throw a radical idea at you. If you really want that, which I believe you do, you don't look like someone who's not saying what she thinks. Why don't you call for the breakup of Tesco? It has.
I wouldn't not call for that.
You wouldn't?
I wouldn't not call for that, but I'm focusing on building the alternatives as far as you can. I understand that's limited by the encroachment of Tesco, though, as well.
How popular would it be to break up Tesco? In Machynlleth, very, but I think with respect, you're probably pretty much on your own. Where would we get our bananas from? Exactly. Yeah. Give the man the banana.
All right. No,
Where your point was, where would we get our bananas from if you bring it? Yeah.
apparently I don't need them.
Apparently you don't need them. That's exactly it. No, this is a really big issue. I agree. I'm glad this has come out because it's about needs and wants, isn't it? The moment we can get anything we want, food, even for people on low incomes. Well, my colleague Martin works on this, and the bottom 10% are really struggling on the price of food. Okay, so let's think. But for everyone else, when you get to a professor, do I think about the price of food? Yeah, I do, because it's my work. But do I worry about it? No. I would be lying if I said I did. But today, my wife Liz and I met someone, had 7 kids, and she was 40. 7 children, 40. And her husband had left her. She worried about the price of food very much indeed. You mustn't forget that. So balancing wants and needs and affordability and non-affordability is a very tricky issue, which I'm sure your course is going to resolve for all the students overnight and instantly. But how do we balance that? Because one slide I went over very fast, I'll see if I can flick back to it, actually is now relevant, that one. This is from my friend Patrick Holden's Sustainable Food Trust. They did a study which I thought was very good, but I think it needs a lot more work. But because it was the first to do this in a big way, it was making lots of suppositions. It was saying, well, you know, what's the cost of food? And it itemized all the externalized costs from the British food system. This is for the UK, sorry. So you notice there the total external costs, things that aren't included in the price of the food that you pay at Tesco. Natural capital degradation, that's land. Public health accounting for half of it. Food imports, not knowing very much about what comes from them. You know, research, these subsidies then in 2014, it was actually 2015 was 2.95 billion this is. So they said basically UK food should basically double. In 2015, the gross value added of food was 120 billion. So it was exactly doubling. They said food should really be costing twice as much. Now that's really tricky if you're on a very low wage. So how do we deal with that? Because this is absolutely right. Some of us, Mike Raynor at Oxford, when I started talking with him about this argument on the public health, you know, we were much bigger than how do you cost this? So where does your banana come into that?
Okay, then there was a few things that you were saying earlier about how to deliver some of this. So Mr. Drakeford, because that's the Assembly top man, why can't the Welsh Government buy agricultural land if it's so cheap and it's going to be worth so much more? Why can't we use the public service boards as a mechanism of localisation to deliver these things and challenge them to bring that to the fore? And it covers health, it covers sickness, etc., but they've not discussed food, in my opinion. And
now I think, you see, this is the kind of, that's fantastic. That is pulling together all the things that the others have said and talking about the political process. And exactly, this is fantastic.
And I would suggest that if the Welsh Government owns 7% of the land mass in Wales in forest terms, they've got an example of how to do it.
Not what you're beginning to do is saying, okay, if we want to do that, how are we going to get these bullet points, blocks of interest together to argue it and win the political argument? That's what you're saying. And that goes back to right to what Paul started and we've all responded to. Actually, there's some really good thinking that we've got that we can tap into, but it's going to need us to get organised, actually. And that's what's implied in what you're saying. Absolutely right. So the debate you and I were having, where we were having about, you know, I teased you by saying, should we break up Tesco? I mean, there are arguments for doing it, actually. You know, economic arguments, very powerful. And what is happening in Brexit? Has anyone noticed? Number 2 and number 3 supermarkets are getting together. And they'll be bigger than Tesco. Asda, Sainsbury's will be bigger than Tesco. So 2 companies will have over 60% of the British market, all while Brexit's going on. I mean, you couldn't invent it. So we have some serious organising to do. So I think the point. Has anyone got anything burning they want to say? I mean, we could go on. Yes, gentleman there.
I think in the Brexit campaign, Michael Gove dismissed and belittled experts. So I think I would say to the Prime Minister, listen to the experts, listen to the people who've studied these things and act upon their advice. And I think that applies to just about everything, not just food policy.
Look, I'm a boring professor, so I'd like that sort of comment. I think you're right. What I put here, this was me sitting in my study on my own, trying to answer the questions I've thrown at you. And actually, for me, there are a whole range of people who really know what is going on in food, systemically. If ever I'm stuck, I'll go to environmental health officers, because they always know who's doing what in a region, because they have to register every food business. The problem is they don't actually have much rights of entry or involvement with farming. They just meet it after the farm gate. The Spanish vets meet the farmers. The Spanish vets are going. We've not taken planners seriously. One of the things I think goes back to what you did, Paul, and your colleagues in Zero Carbon Britain. Actually, we're really developing ideas for planners. We're talking about replanning the British food system. In my book, my poor wife knows only too well, I'd come down for a cup of tea at 4 and say, ye gods, I think we need a beverage moment. Now, you think of beverage as the 1942 Health and Social Insurance Act. If you know, anyone here know beverage? One or two of you put hands up. William Beveridge, Sir William Beveridge, he was the architect of the NHS. He was the person who wrote the report in 1942 that 100,000 copies were produced in 1942 in the middle of the war, and it was then turned into pamphlets, millions of them. It was discussed by the Desert Army. Discussed by the Desert Army. Okay. There's suddenly people say, what are we fighting? We're fighting against Nazis? Well, okay. For what? To make a better Britain. Beveridge was the man who basically said Britain has a problem of 5 great, what he called the great wants. One of them was food, need. And he said we need a national insurance system so that no one is poor, basically develop it, and a health system that's funded from it, going further than Lloyd George, the Welshman, who started national insurance at the beginning of the 1900s. I'm not talking about that Beveridge. To me, Beveridge is the senior civil servant of the First Ministry of Food in World War I. You wouldn't know that. Beveridge created the Ministry of Food in 1916 and was brought back in 1936 by some very interesting people inside the British state machine who said, we've got a little trouble going on. We've got this Nazi man, and we've got communists who we don't like, and Stalin, and we've got little difficulties, and America doesn't want to know, and so on. What are we going to do? Should we take food seriously? Let's ask Sir William Beveridge. And he came back and wrote a report that said, holy Moses, we've got to get our act together on food. And it was brilliant. And it led to a huge argument, and basically he wanted to lead it, and nothing happened, and they gave it to someone else, and basically not much preparation went on, a little bit, and then everything he'd argued for was done in 1940, just because the Germans were currently focused elsewhere, as they could have wiped out Britain by just cutting off the food. They started to do it in 1941, by which we'd got the Canadian wheat crop. Land armies set out, local, regional campaigns. This is emergency wartime planning. I'm not thinking we should think like that. I think we need a Beveridge moment where and that's what I think we're in. I think Brexit is our Beveridge moment. Whether we're in, out, or not, we've got to really use this as an opportunity to think really creatively, to talk about the issues that really matter. This is one, like yours about, do I therefore have to give up bananas? Well, maybe not so many, actually. Being honest with you, I don't know how many you eat. I'm not being personal. But Britain's #1 fruit is bananas. Why isn't it apples or pears? How can we make that up? Why are we exporting from Wales mussels to Spain? Did you know we import meat? We import 88% of all the fruit we eat, and we should eat 2-3 times more. I mean, this is... we've got a lot of work to do, basically. But it's not going to be done. I mean, thank you very much for saying about experts. I think experts have a role. I mean, I think we should have a National Council of Food. I do think we should have one. I think the ministers in Wales should have there should be a National Food Council for Wales to start thinking about this and feeding ideas in. You're right. The Scandinavians have that. And they do it, and it's making a difference. They're doing much more interesting things than us. Look, on that sober note, I think I should stop because only one of you is left, so I've done something wrong. You should be asleep by now. Look, this is a long process. And for the students who are with us tomorrow, we'll pick up some of this and look at what's the role of evidence in policy? Does evidence make any difference? You're saying it does. Sometimes evidence, I think, makes no difference at all. In fact, you get great things just by knowing the president's wife. Much more important. Much more important. 3 minutes with Mrs. Gates might be worth more than building a social movement. I actually think that's true, but I don't want that sort of world, is my personal opinion. I think it's social movements or bust. So we've got to basically, I think you in Wales, you should argue for a catch, should try and argue why haven't we created a Central Wales Council of Food. There's your thought. Okay, let's stop.